Welcome to You, Me, Empathy. Thank you for listening. We would like to remind you that this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Known as just a silly boy with a feely heart. Please consider supporting the show. Check us out on Patreon or simply leave a review on iTunes. Here's your host and creator of the show, Known Wells.
Hello, Feely Humans. Welcome to another episode of You, Me, Empathy. My name is Known Wells, and this is episode 109 with my guest, Christy Harrison. Christy is an anti-diet registered dietitian, nutritionist, and certified intuitive eating counselor based in New York. She has a podcast called the Food Psych Podcast. She offers online courses and intuitive eating coaching. She is so very knowledgeable about people's relationships with food and body liberation and health at every size and disordered eating and just the gross diet culture that persists today. We had an amazing conversation, and I really, really value Christy's heart and brain. And I hope you enjoy this episode too. Before we get to it, though, please go follow Feely Human on the socials, at Feely Human on Instagram and Twitter, facebook.com/FeelyHuman. Feely Human is the Feely Human Collective, a new upcoming collaborative mental health platform that the launch team is available now. You can go to feelyhuman.co and check that out and join the launch team. But in just about a week or two, I'll be announcing a date very soon. In a couple of weeks, I'll be revealing the crowdfunding campaign for the Feely Human Collective. I'm so excited to share that with you, everyone. Lots of amazing things. And if you're following Feely Human on Instagram and Twitter, you'll see a few of those things like pins and t-shirts and stickers and things. But really can't wait to share this with you. Go to feelyhuman.co. Make sure to follow at feelyhuman and follow Instagram and follow You, Me, Empathy, of course, at You, Me, Empathy. Okay, let's get to the episode now. This is episode 109, Anti-Diet, with Christy Harrison.
La la la, you, me, empathy, yeah, la la la.
Welcome to You, Me, Empathy, a podcast about exploring the struggles we face in our day-to-day lives as humans trying to get by on this wondrous and overwhelming pale blue dot. The intent of You, Me, Empathy is to talk openly, without judgment, about our mental health, our neuroses, our shared anxieties and worries, to create a dialogue that is vulnerable and deeply human and empathetic, and to share that dialogue with others to inspire emotional and cognitive collaboration and insight so we can, hand in hand, break down the stigma that make us feel shame and guilt for struggling, for feeling our feelings, for being feely humans. You, Me, Empathy is a safe, friendly space designed to inspire the beauty in each of us. Today, I am full-hearted to be here with journalist, intuitive eating counselor, food psych podcast host, and author of the new book, Anti-Diet. It's Christy Harrison. Hello, Christy.
Hello, Known. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So happy to have you. I am very excited about your upcoming book. I mean, it's upcoming now. We're recording this in November, and your book's out in December.
Yeah, not too long from now. It might be even out by the time this comes out, depending.
Well, we can talk about that at the end and time it right,
Yes.
however you want. But I'm very excited about this book, and I'd imagine it was quite a feat to put together.
Yeah, it was. It was honestly 10 years in the making, I would say.
Wow.
And, not 10 years writing, of course, but 10 years ago, I decided in my copious spare time when I was in grad school for public health, nutrition, and dietetics that I wanted to write a book. And I had started my career as a journalist, so this wasn't a totally foreign thing. I had worked for 7 years full-time in media by the time I went back to school and was still freelancing while I was in school. So it was, sort of a normal-ish thing to do, I guess, but I did not have the time for it.
Sure.
But I decided I wanted to write a book about, it would be a cultural history of emotional eating. That was my idea. And at the time, I still sort of identified myself as an emotional eater. So I was thinking of it as being part memoir, part cultural history, part, scientific sort of inquiry. Didn't really know what it was going to look like until I started researching it. And when I got into the research, I think I was just discovering things that in retrospect were so antithetical to what I had learned about nutrition and dietetics and weight and food up until that point that I couldn't piece it together. I was just like, what is happening? Does not compute.
Wow.
And so, the book proposal didn't end up going anywhere because I just couldn't finish it. There was this mental block, but I still was really interested in people's relationships with food. And so in 2013, I decided to start a podcast. And that's when I started Food Psych. And that was exploring a lot of the ideas that I had started to delve into in that book proposal. And so then Food Psych became a place to explore, people's relationships with food, but then it got deeper into eating disorders. And I started to specialize in my clinical practice in disordered eating and eating disorders. And then I got into intuitive eating and health at every size. And so the podcast was really a place to explore and flesh out and delve into these ideas that I hadn't really had the space or the even sort of reference point or the language to delve into in that original book proposal. And then over the years, I've been doing the podcast almost 7 years now. It became this sort of wealth of interviews and quotes and discussions with people around these issues of, body size acceptance, eating disorder recovery, intuitive eating, body liberation, really. And so that was what ended up sort of helping me create this book. And so the book is kind of the culmination of all these years of research and conversations and exploration around what ultimately I've come to understand as diet culture, this system of beliefs in our culture that, demonizes some foods while elevating others, stigmatizes larger bodies and worships smaller ones, holds weight loss up as this, path to success and moral virtue and health, and oppresses people who don't match up with that standard of supposed health. Gotcha. So that's, really the story of how the book came to be. But yeah, it's been a long and winding path, to say the least.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds incredible, and I really can't wait to delve into it once it's here, and needed too. It's so all of this sort of health at every size, these sort of body liberation, body positivity, these concepts are present and they're being talked about. And I think it's so important. And for someone like me who grew up in an environment that I guess was kind of, my mom used to teach aerobics with Richard Simmons.
Oh, wow.
In the 70s. And I'm 38, so I sort of lived through the 90s and sort of the diet fad craze of the 90s and all that stuff. And we were raised in a very healthy environment. And I do sometimes wonder if that sort of had a play in my own sort of eating disorder journey. But all of that to say that all of this stuff now, I think I'm open to it and sort of receptive to it because my heart is open, but for the longest time my heart wasn't, and I was sort of hiding all of the things. So all of that to say, Christy, what you're doing with your podcast and this book, it's so important, and I just commend you wholeheartedly. It's lovely.
Oh, thank you so much. And I will say too, my heart wasn't always open to this stuff either. We're actually the same age. I'm 38 also. So I lived through a lot of that low fat diet craze. I lived through the sort of, Pollinification of nutrition and dietetics in the early 2000s. And that was actually what sort of drove me to want to report on food and nutrition, go back to school to become a dietitian, go get my master's in public health nutrition. I was really in it. And, when I first was introduced to Health at Every Size, at that point, it was just a little over 10 years ago. It was around the same time as I started writing this book proposal that I was talking about. And I was not open to it whatsoever. A friend introduced me to it who was a fellow journalist, and I was just not having it because I was back in school to become a dietitian. I had spent all this money to, do this program that was teaching me that the quote unquote obesity epidemic was going to kill us and all of this stuff. And so I just wasn't in this space to really take it in. And I also hadn't healed my own relationship with food yet either completely. So there was that piece too. I think a lot of times, people who are struggling in their own relationships with food are often very resistant to the messages of Health at Every Size at first, because it's really antithetical to everything we believe and have internalized from diet culture. And those voices are really loud when we're struggling with our own disordered eating.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'd like to, what sort of feeds into the book and the work you're doing with food, with your podcast, that I want to delve into deeply, but I also want to sort of start a little bit before that and get into, can you give me like a seminal moment or two, like about sort of in your mental health journey that sort of preceded your time, in school, preceded your time sort of starting to look into this stuff and your maybe experience with food, your relationship with food growing up. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's where I love to start. I start every episode of my podcast there too, because I think our relationships with food growing up really set the stage for so much, Totally. So my relationship with food growing up was pretty positive, I would say. I was I've always been in a thinner body and never had people telling me I needed to lose weight. So I never had that piece that often gets in the way of people having a peaceful relationship with food. I certainly had other mental health struggles. I have had anxiety and, PTSD really for many, many years. Was never diagnosed until my adult years. So I, certainly struggled with other mental health challenges, but my relationship with food was okay. Certainly my relationship with my body growing up as a young woman in the 80s and 90s was, fraught for sure. Like everyone, I think, everyone under the sun has a bit of a struggle in their relationship with their body, especially now, I think. But, back then too, it was, worrying about the shape of my body, worrying about the weight I was gaining in adolescence, and just sort of, I would say, normative discontent. That's the word. I mean, it's really depressing that we have that term for, what should not really exist. I don't think people should feel bad about their bodies at all, but it wasn't really anything out of the ordinary, I would say.
Yeah.
But that all changed. So, and I was an intuitive eater, I should say too, throughout my childhood and into my early adulthood. But then when I was 20, I went in my junior year of college, I went to study abroad in Paris, and it was a wonderful experience, but it also was the start of my disordered eating path. Not for the reasons you might think. I certainly was eating a lot more like delicious, rich food and, experiencing all the Parisian cuisine, but I don't think that was the issue. I think what happened was I went on a different birth control pill. I had seen my doctor before I went away, and she said, I can't really write you a prescription for a year's worth of pills, but I can give you samples. I have 12 months worth of samples of this pill here if you want to take it. I was like, yes, free drugs, please. And so I took, got on a different pill, and it made me gain weight really quickly. It was one of the side effects of that pill, which I later learned was really not a great fit for my body. But weight gain just being one of a number of side effects. And, having grown up in a thin body, it insulated me from those messages of weight loss being directed at me, but I still heard them around me all the time. I still was growing up in diet culture like everyone does, and I still kind of tucked those messages away in the back of my mind. So when I did end up gaining weight, all those messages came flooding to the fore. And it was like, okay, got to lose weight. This is the time, it's happening. And so I started restricting my eating. I started dabbling in exercise to try to lose weight. And, it started, like most diets do, like most people, when they first start trying to lose weight, there is some effect short-term temporarily, right? So that happened for me. I started getting compliments on the weight loss. And then I came back to the US and I ended up switching back to the other birth control pill that I had been on. And I think that's really what, changed my weight significantly, because the weight gain had been primarily just a side effect of this birth control pill. So I lost weight pretty rapidly, but I kept going. I was already in this disordered mindset of got to lose weight, got to keep up these behaviors and add more behaviors. And, when I got back, it was, I think it was 2002, the US had just come into the age of Atkins. Everything was low carb, right? And so I started dabbling in low carb diets and experimenting with Atkins and South Beach and all these different things. And, suddenly it was kind of like, I say, like unlocking a new level in life. Like I never had a sort of way to bond with other women in particular, or people I didn't really know so well, in the way that I did after I started dieting. Like it was a sort of
interesting.
It was this really interesting new way of bonding with people and of kind of bridging from small talk to intimacy. Cause I've always kind of struggled with small talk and, really like to get into deep conversations and don't have a lot of time for just sort of like,
sports, weather.
I can't.
So what would you talk about?
So it would be like, dieting, like low carb stuff. I mean, the people that I sort of knew were like, oh, wow, you've lost weight. You look great. What's your secret, basically? And so that was a way in to say like, oh, here's all the stuff I'm doing. And then sometimes we'd get into, because I was already at this point starting to have the side effects that are really common and sort of come on the heels of any quote unquote successful weight loss, which was binge eating and, not feeling able to control myself around food, especially the foods I was depriving myself of, AKA carbs. And so, sometimes I would talk with people about those struggles, but oftentimes it was sort of, just, I don't know, like just general diet talk, right? Like, here's what I'm trying. Here's this recipe that I made, but it felt so important. It felt like we were, and
like
also
a community.
Felt like a community. And especially as I got more into the food politics stuff, it really started to feel like truly quote unquote important. Like we were dealing with social issues and like real issues, so it'd be like, I'm shopping organic. I'm only buying local. I'm trying to be gluten-free, this and that. And so it had this, I've always been someone who was concerned with social justice, although certainly imperfectly as a young white person growing up, but like, I've always had an interest in social justice and social movements. And so it felt like sort of tied right into that. It quickly went from just sort of my personal quote unquote weight loss journey to this idea of, but I'm changing the world. I'm buying organic and local and sustainable, and I'm helping the environment and I'm helping change the food system for the better. And so that really was insidious because it gave this sort of mandate and this halo to what was really a disordered relationship with food. And, what I've come to see later and so many of my clients that I've worked with since is that particular framing of it as like, this is important for the world, you're saving the planet with your choices, et cetera, really lights the match to all of this diet culture tinder that exists for all of us already. And, so I was feeling very guilty about my food choices, really sort of obsessive about making sure that I was eating as quote unquote cleanly as possible. Although that term clean eating didn't even really come on the scene until later. It was sort of the proto clean eating movement that I got caught up in.
Yeah.
And so, I ended up, I mean, I was starting my career as a journalist at that point, and I ended up specializing in food and nutrition reporting because that was what I was obsessed with. And you sort of need a beat and a specialization as a journalist. And so I think I was really quite disordered about food, and definitely had what would be diagnosed as a full-blown eating disorder at various points. I never did receive the diagnosis, though, because I never got emaciated and never got quote unquote thin enough for providers to call me out, which is, I think, an example of weight stigma and how that shows up in medicine and in psychotherapy. And so it kind of muddled along and was able to be functionally very disordered with food for a good 10 years, 8 to 10 years.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
It's so, what strikes me is so, like, you use the word insidious, and I think that's perfect. It's so complex. Like, I didn't even think about the sort of added complex layer of the sort of social justice piece of it. Like, eating is hard. It's not hard, but eating is such a complex thing in and of itself, right? We're like nourishing our bodies, we're feeding our bodies, we're feeding our souls. Like it's a thing that we all need to do, and then we add these layers of cultural stigma. We add these, all this nonsense, this sort of external validation stuff that all of us buy into and none of us need, and it just makes it so difficult.
Yeah. Totally. It's that, sort of dovetailing of the personal, because I also, I said that I've had anxiety and, PTSD and had sort of difficulties with social, had social anxiety in different moments of my life as sort of how it manifested. And I think having that, social justice mandate and the way of connecting with other people around dieting and food made it, really just tied into my pre-existing issues. And I think all of us kind of, especially as you say, feely humans, people who are highly sensitive or kind of don't fit the mainstream mold of, never think only, never feel, only think, kind of, struggle with feeling out of place and
Absolutely.
Not feeling like we fit. And so having a diet or a, quote unquote lifestyle that promises all of these things and seems to deliver all of these things, a purpose, a community, a mission, a goal in life, is really intoxicating and really irresistible.
Yeah. It's hard to not listen to it.
Mm-hmm.
I like when I was like, I have a history with anorexia myself, and it's powerful. It's incredibly powerful. It's intoxicating, as you say. And in my sort of early recovery, I recall people commenting on sort of the strength, my muscles, for instance, like commenting, "Oh, you look strong." And I remember feeling, this was early in my recovery, so 10 years ago or so. Remember feeling like, no, I don't want that. Like I didn't, like, it's like I was still holding on to that power. I was still holding on to like, no, that's not what I want. Right. Like, that's not the ideal that I'm striving for. I'm striving for, whatever it was, but I don't know. It's so difficult. It's hard.
It's really hard. And I think our culture makes it so hard because,
yes.
Like you said, and in recovery, when people knew you were recovering from a life-threatening illness, they're still commenting on your body. And like, that's a product of diet culture, I think. Even if it was seemingly positive, even if it was them trying to encourage you, it's like our culture still makes us so conscious of our own bodies and everyone else's bodies and feel entitled to comment on people's body shapes and sizes. And everything else about their bodies too. Yeah. And so it's a very hard culture to recover in. And I think it makes complete sense why so many of us struggle with disordered eating in this culture, because it's very normalized. It's, that normative discontent that I mentioned is just sort of the way of the world. And it's kind of odd if people don't have some issues with food in their body in this culture.
Right. There's something about identity too that, like, we talk about identity on this podcast a lot, and I'm always sort of vacillating between the value of sort of holding on to like these pieces of our identity. Like I'm recovered, or I, deal with depression, or things like I'm white privileged male. Like all these things are important to call out, and they hold weight. But I also think they can be tools for exclusion, right? And tools for divisiveness, and tools for holding us back in some ways. And I think the same works for diet, clearly.
Yeah, for sure. I think the identity of a certain diet, or being a dieter, or being a part of a certain quote unquote lifestyle or plan or program or protocol or whatever they call themselves now, because they don't call themselves diets anymore. They don't want to be associated with that word. But having an identity as someone who's part of a certain dietary regime, I think keeps people really stuck. And it's a false sense of community too. I think that's the thing that, we're all looking for community in this world where we're so divided and increasingly atomized in our little worlds and our, different devices. It makes sense that we're looking for a sense of community. And yet the community that we find in diet culture is a false one. It's not a genuine sense of community where people would accept you no matter what. It's contingent. It's conditional,
Would you say it persists because of insecurity? It persists because of, self-hating behavior, those types of things?
I think that's definitely part of it. But I think also looking at the sort of larger structural issues, it's like that insecurity and those self-hating behaviors come from somewhere, and they come from fair. This, from this system of beliefs that indoctrinates us and inculcates us with those beliefs and behaviors. So, we come to believe that larger bodies are bad and smaller bodies are good. We're told constantly that, our health is at risk if we gain weight, or if we weigh quote unquote too much. And there's just so many things, especially for people in larger bodies in this culture. It's reinforced at every turn, and people with chronic illnesses too, to some extent. This fat phobia and food phobia is really reinforced constantly for some people in particular, I think, but for all of us really too. It's used to be sort of a upper middle class or middle class cisgender female issue, like that. Right. Dieting was sort of something that group engaged in. But I think nowadays it's really affecting everyone, across the gender spectrum, across the economic spectrum. I hear from so many people from so many different backgrounds that they've struggled with this stuff, and it might show up differently or look different depending on the cultural context. But these same larger cultural pressures are acting on people. Yeah. And it's, when I in researching my book, I was looking into the roots and the history of diet culture, and it's fascinating how diet culture is interconnected with and grows out of these other forms of oppression, like patriarchy and white supremacy and, gender policing and all of this stuff that is problematic in and of itself, but also that, kind of provided the root system for diet culture to grow and take its own shape.
I recently went to visit Rock Haven Sanitarium in LA, like the Glendale area, I think. And it's this old sanitarium. Eventually, like in the 30s during the Depression, it was a place for basically men to send their wives to this place to be out of the way, if they are experiencing pain or if they're experiencing quote unquote hysteria, right? And then, into the 60s and 70s, it became this sort of like posh kind of, like rehab, like rehabilitation, rest, R&R sort of type of place. And I think there was like, they were mentioning there were like those sort of belly fat machines, remember those? They like
the little vibrating belts,
vibrating things. Yeah, it's just like, goodness.
Ugh.
And it just, when will it end? Like, because like we talk about the 90s and Atkins and Richard Simmons and Richard Simmons, I think, did a lot of good for sure. But like, there's just so much of it, and it's like we're just putting on a new bow every decade.
That's it. That's totally it. It's not anything new. And in fact, when you mentioned those like vibrating belts, I'm thinking back to the research I did showing that those sprang up in like the 1930s. That's like the first mention I saw of those.
Yeah.
And, really diet culture didn't exist. The idea that larger bodies needed to be made smaller did not exist in any concerted way in the Western world until the mid 1800s. It was, certainly back in ancient Greece and Rome was kind of the first evidence I saw of any sort of qualms about fatness, but it wasn't like a systemic oppression the way it is now, the way it's become. And, diet culture as we know it now in this systemic oppressive way really didn't spring up until the mid 1800s in the US or Western world. And so, it's like has a finite history, but from that inception point until now, it's like we've recycled the same ideas over and over and over again.
Yeah.
The first big diet bestseller that sort of took diets from the realm of like the medical field into self-help was in the 1860s.
Wow.
And that book was basically a proto Atkins. It was like a low carb, high meat, high fat diet that, basically you look at it now and it's like everything in there is pretty, consistent with something like Atkins, or keto now is the new version of that, right? Keto is the new Atkins.
Right.
And, except for there were like 6 glasses of wine a day in the Banting diet, it was called.
Oh my goodness.
Which,
Sign me up for that.
I know, right? And apparently that was to help counteract the constipating effects of eating almost nothing but meat.
Jeez Louise.
I know. Now, people are doing different things to try to counteract that, but it's, so there's really nothing new under the sun, right? It's just, they're recycling it. And because people are getting wise to the fact that diets don't work, we have decades worth of evidence showing that, for about a year or so, people might be able to lose some weight and keep it off. But when you look at the 5-year mark, most, if not all, people have regained all the weight they lost. So up to 98% of people will regain all the weight they lost within a 5-year period, if not more. And in fact, up to 2/3 of people end up regaining more weight than they lost.
Wow.
And, which could possibly account for the fact that people's weights, in general have gone up over time. I think diet culture is definitely a part of that. Not that there's anything wrong with higher weights or gaining weight or larger bodies, because, I'm very clear that is not, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no moral or health failing in having a larger body.
Totally.
And, diet culture tells us that intentional weight loss is the way to shrink your body permanently. And the science tells a very different story.
Yeah, I mean, I have like a side tangent real quick, and then I'll get back to actually responding to that. Remember the fat-free yogurt craze of the 90s?
Oh, yes. Ugh.
Oh my gosh, there were yogurt shops everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I remember they even sort of parodied it on Seinfeld. Do you remember that episode?
I don't remember that one, no.
Like they go to this yogurt shop and Newman's just very excited, and he's saying it's fat free, and he's laughing, and it's very funny.
That's hilarious.
Yeah,
it was fat was the dietary demon of the day, right? And then now it's carbs. There's something different vilified now, but it's the same process. It's the same pattern. It's like nothing new.
Yeah, so I guess it's like in the best interest of these giant capitalistic, anti-empathetic corporations like Weight Watchers to just try to keep, innovating. I don't know if innovating is like fair to say, but whatever they're doing, they're just repackaging, things like trying to get young kids to lose weight.
Yeah. Oh, it's horrifying. This new attempt to recruit children as the targets of their diet advertising and their diet plans and programs, which I think up until this point, no one had ever wanted to touch. No diet company had really directly marketed to kids. And it's sort of a new low, I think, for Weight Watchers. And, from a business perspective, I kind of get it because they're struggling. They're losing market share. I think people are getting wise to the fact that diets don't work, and Weight Watchers has weight in the name, so it can't kind of say, oh, this isn't about weight loss or this is just about health. It's like, no, literally weight's in your name, which is why they have tried and only somewhat succeeded to rebrand as WW instead of Weight Watchers. The last I heard, it like wasn't really working because people weren't understanding that it was still Weight Watchers. And so they've kind of like walked back some of that marketing and are now saying WW, formerly Weight Watchers or something, to try to like ease the transition. But yeah, they're struggling to maintain their position. Oprah bought, 10% of their shares or something like that, and it still wasn't enough. And so I think that, it is this capitalistic effort to get more clients, get more customers, and targeting children is like opening up a whole new customer base, right? And it's just horrifying because it really is anti-empathetic. It's not looking out for people's well-being. It's not looking out for children's mental health and, everyone's mental health. But I mean, putting kids on diets is a very well-known risk factor for eating disorders and lifelong struggles in people's relationships with food. Yeah. And, they're trying to wave that all away. There was one study done by some researchers who are funded by the diet industry, trying to say that, actually dieting, weight loss plans for kids don't cause disordered eating. And in fact, they help people recover from eating disorders, with very judicious manipulation of the data to try to prove, or, to show that. Ignoring decades worth of research and clinical wisdom among the eating disorder professionals. And so, I think, they're in a place where they're really kicking and screaming, and trying to hold on to market share. I found a report by an independent research firm, market research firm that does consulting and strategic planning to the diet industry. And this report is fascinating in how it frames things because it's very above board. It's very like, any company that continues to target baby boomers only is sure to wither and die. Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig are your grandmother's weight loss companies. They have to, move into the 21st century and target millennials. And millennials are really interested in wellness, and they're really interested in quote unquote clean eating and no artificial foods and flavors. And so if you want to stay afloat, basically you have to court this demographic. You have to court the millennial generation by changing your branding, changing your programs and marketing. And lo and behold, Weight Watchers did exactly that. Like, it's really interesting to see the playbook, that I got that report in 2017. And then in 2018, they changed their name and they rebrand, or reformulate all their food products to have no artificial flavors and colors and ingredients. So it's really, I think it's capitalism. It's an effort to maintain their lock on the market. And I think it'll be interesting as this anti-diet movement grows, and, hopefully my book will contribute to that, to see what diet companies end up doing. What ways in which are, in what ways are they going to be stealthier and trying to adapt to, quote unquote health language rather than making themselves about weight loss. And in what ways are they going to start doing really nefarious things like putting out their own research that supposedly refutes a lot of the anti-diet research that's out there, a lot of the research that supports anti-diet positions. So I think we got to really watch out for that and really be critical consumers when it comes to anything to do with nutrition, food, and health.
Yeah. I mean, it both gives me some hope and also depresses me, Christy, because it is this vile sort of attempt to just keep making money and existing. And I get it. It's a business. And so it has to make money to go on and pay employees. But I also just I'm sort of heartbroken by the idea of them sort of operating under this same philosophy and just sort of tweaking things here and there. It's like, in my mind, a company like Weight Watchers should maybe just go away. Like they're sort of a remnant of this sort of awful, misguided way to look at food. And, maybe that's not fair, but
no, I
don't know.
agree. I fully agree. I think they're a huge part of the problem. They were there at the inception of kind of the modern era of diet culture in the 1960s, when diet culture sort of ramped up to a new level. Twiggy came on the scene and the thin ideal shrunk even further, and yeah, I definitely don't see a way that Weight Watchers could exist and, not be doing harm in some way.
Yeah.
Just because of their legacy. I mean, I think, if they were to break down everything they've ever done, completely reconfigure their company, their mission, the products that they sell, the services that they sell, maybe that would be a start, but I do think that, the world would probably be a better place if they just shut their doors. And if all those people who, they have some brilliant minds working there, right? And if those folks could get wise to what the research really says about diets and the oppressive nature of diet culture and the ways that it's harmed people, maybe those people could go on to do great things in the world and, use their powers for good instead of evil.
Yeah, I like that. So thinking about these corporations that influence so much and all of this talk, and you see Instagram ads with drink this shake and, Facebook ads and, all this stuff, we're just inundated with diet stuff. For you, Christy, for your own sort of personal journey, coming out of like a more disordered eating, how did you start to pull away from that and find peace in your food experiences?
Yeah, it was a really slow process, I will say. I think it started with discovering the book Intuitive Eating, actually. But I was also in therapy for anxiety and, general life stuff, trauma. And so I think it was timing really worked out in a way because I was starting to research that book. I discovered the book Intuitive Eating through that and was working with my therapist at the time and sort of bringing the information to her and talking with her about it. And she doesn't specialize in disordered eating, but she was able to see that this was an area that I was struggling with and I needed support around. And I think sort of knew enough to know that intuitive eating seemed to be resonating with me and that it seemed to be a really positive step out of the disordered eating that I was in. Mm-hmm. And so really supported me in that process of, starting to make peace with food, stopping, restricting myself of particular foods, starting to allow myself to eat when I was hungry and recognize my hunger because I was identifying as an emotional eater still. And she was like, well, let's look at what's coming up for you in the moments before you have one of these emotional eating episodes. Like, what thoughts are you thinking? What's going through your mind? What are you feeling in your body? And just kind of slow it down and, journal about that before you start eating. And when I did that, the thing that kept coming up was like, I'm hungry. A little voice in my head was just like, when I started tuning into my body, right? When I started noticing what was actually going on in my body, I felt hunger. And I brought that to my therapist and she was like, okay. What about that, right? What if you were to eat when you're hungry? And at first I was like, oh no, are you kidding? I've already eaten enough for the day. I've had my allotted calories, and so kind of chipping away at that resistance with my therapist was really important. And really starting to trust that my body had its own wisdom and that it knew what it needed and that a lot of times it just really did need food. And I was trying to think my way out of it. I was trying to think my way into something else I could do with my time or, a way that I could process my emotions without having to eat. And my body just wouldn't let that happen. It kept coming back to actually you need to eat. And actually now that I specialize in disordered eating and have done a lot of the research in this area, I've really come to see that emotional eating for most people is not actually about emotions at all. It's about hunger. It's about deprivation. It's about a physiological need that's not being met. That, when we get so deprived, we're more likely to eat in the presence of negative emotions, because that sort of breaks down our willpower that we use to govern, the dieters use to govern their eating the rest of the time. And also that deprivation and dieting drive negative emotions. It makes you feel very irritable, very anxious and on edge, and maybe depressed and sad to not have enough food. And so, when you're healing from emotional eating, really the first line of defense is eating more, eating enough, making sure you're getting an abundance of food, of, a wide variety of foods, all the food that you want and need. And then if the emotional eating persists after, months and months of making sure that you really are eating enough and challenging the beliefs that make you not eat enough, so that you're in a state of, non-deprivation, you're in a state of satisfaction. If the feelings of emotional eating persist after that, then you can start to look at what are some other coping skills I can use to deal with these emotions when they come up. But the effort to layer on new coping skills when the real problem is deprivation is always going to backfire, in my view. It's never going to really work, because it's just trying to distract you from your true need, which is food.
That's so fascinating. And I love what you said about, it's really about listening to our bodies and being in tune with our bodies. And that's really so much about this experience of living, this thing we call living is I think that the more we can be in touch with our bodies and listen into what our body is telling us, I think the more fruitful life will be, because we're listening, we're actively listening, we're picking up those cues, we're getting that information, and then we're acting on it, because no one else is going to do that job.
Yeah, so true. And that's really what intuition is too, right? It's listening to those cues that our body's picking up, and our body really has wisdom of its own. I think in Western culture, we place such a primacy on the mental wisdom. We don't care about body wisdom the way that we need to, because that's a really important part of, decision making, is listening to your body's cues around how do you feel when you think about, doing a certain thing? How do you feel when you're in the presence of a certain person? It really expands so far beyond just food. And that's one thing that I found in my healing my relationship with food and coming to be more of an intuitive eater, is that I was able to be more of an intuitive liver as well. I was, able to be intuitive about what was fulfilling me career-wise, what was fulfilling me romantically, what was fulfilling me in terms of hobbies and the ways I spent my time, and what didn't feel good, what didn't feel safe. And, I've had an experience of some abusive relationships in the past as well, and learning to notice those signals that my body was giving me of oh, my palms are sweating and my heart's racing when I'm around this person, but not in a good way, not in the way that, it is when I have butterflies. It's a different feeling. And what is this feeling? Is this unsafety? Is this a feeling of danger? And, so intuitive eating really can have ripple effects into all areas of our lives.
Yeah. How do we, a part of my goal of this podcast is about creating the safety for us to go on those journeys, right? How do we as humans, in particular when it comes to eating, create those safe spaces so we can be more intuitive with our eating? We can sort of just be more mindful of the food that we put in our bodies. How can we create those safe spaces?
Yeah, I think it's a really complex process and a long process. Yeah. But I think the first step, the first sort of foundation of it for everyone, no matter your, socioeconomic status or anything else, is making sure you have enough food and consistent, reliable access to food. And so obviously that's going to be difficult for someone who does have food insecurity, right? Because the consistent, reliable access to food might not be there. But, if that person wants to heal their relationship with food and feel more at peace with food and everything else in life, sort of prioritizing and figuring out ways to do that, ways to get that consistent access and get those food needs met is going to be really important. And then for everyone, people who are economically stable and privileged also need that safety, that sense of safety with enough food. There's a colleague of mine named Ellen Satter who has this great concept called the hierarchy of food needs, much like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where the first level of the hierarchy is safety, right?
Yeah.
Is security. And similarly in Satter's hierarchy of food needs, it's the first level is enough food, is consistent, reliable access to food. And I think that's really challenging in this culture that makes people so deprived of food and that, demonizes having access to consistent, enough food. And so I think that's really where it needs to start. And that in and of itself is so challenging because it opens up these rabbit holes of, okay, why do I feel, sort of barring food insecurity, why do I feel the need to restrict my food? Why do I feel like I can't let myself have enough food? And, that often goes back to beliefs about weight, beliefs about self-worth tied up with weight, messages you've gotten about maybe eating quote unquote too much as a child or being quote unquote greedy or gluttonous. Those messages are prominent in our culture. And so kind of unlearning all of that. So it really is a very complex and deep process that I think, even just that first step requires a lot of groundwork to be laid.
Yeah.
But once you have that sense of safety and trust where your body trusts that you do have enough food, then you can start looking at other things. Then you can start looking at, okay, what foods are more satisfying for longer? What's going to help sustain me, through this afternoon of meetings back to back? Or when can I add in a snack to my day so that I feel sustained? Or, the sort of more nuanced, subtle ways of thinking about food and thinking about food as a sense of fuel as well as a sense of pleasure, and taking pleasure in food and finding satisfaction, which again is a whole big thing. Like allowing yourself to have pleasure and satisfaction in food is blocked by so many diet culture beliefs, right? Oh, I don't deserve that. I'm not allowed to have pleasure in food because it's quote unquote unhealthy. The foods that I like, that I find pleasurable, are bad for me, and in certain cases, certainly with people with certain chronic diseases, there might be some consideration of that, right? Someone with celiac disease who wants gluten, who wants a delicious sourdough gluten-y bread, might have to consider that, okay, that's probably not going to make me feel so hot,
Yeah.
And also, no matter what chronic illness you have, no matter what, needs your body has, you do still have full unconditional permission to eat everything and anything you want because you have body autonomy, and you are allowed to make that choice if that's what is going to be nourishing to you mentally, and so kind of learning, that's like further down the road of intuitive eating is learning, okay, like I trust now that I do have full unconditional permission to eat everything that I want, whenever I want. And there's no limitations, there's no restrictions on the foods I can eat. And so now let's look at what do I actually want and what makes me feel good and what maybe doesn't make me feel good.
Yeah.
And that's tricky in diet culture too, because in this day and age of diet culture, it's really about cutting out foods, eliminating certain foods for supposed health reasons. Most of the time, which don't have any scientific basis. So things like the Whole30, for example, these elimination diets aimed at the general public. People with genuine food allergies and intolerances are in the single digit percentages of the population. Less than 1% of people have celiac disease. Less than 1% of people have other food allergy, different other food allergies. It's not rampant the way that something like Whole30 makes it out to be. And so for the vast majority of the population, there's not going to be certain foods that are, that they're quote unquote intolerant to, or that they have to be so granular about, oh, when I eat this, it makes me feel this way. And oh, this particular food has like a stinging sensation in my intestines. I literally had a client say that to me once, like this food sort of stings. And it's like, all right, let's look at because, when you're really in touch with your body, I don't think that it gets that granular. I think that there's a lot of
stingy.
Yeah, no. And not to say that like people can't or don't, but I for this particular person anyway, and I think in general for most people, that level of attention to detail of how your body feels after eating certain foods is in and of itself a symptom of a disordered relationship with food, right? That level of granularity is a symptom of the problem. Yeah. Not that the feeling is a symptom, but that the belief that you're feeling that way is a symptom. And we do know that, from the research on various digestive conditions and different foods, that there's a thing called the nocebo effect, which is very strong in any sort of nutrition research, and especially things around elimination diets. So the nocebo effect is basically the opposite of the placebo effect. Placebo effect says, you take this inert substance that doesn't actually have any effect, and you feel better because you believe it's going to make you feel better. The nocebo effect is you're believing that something is causing harm, and so it does. So when you eat it or consume it, you feel negative symptoms and effects from that thing, even though the food itself or the substance itself is not causing any effects.
Wow.
And
that's wild.
It's totally wild. It's really a testament to the power of the mind-body connection.
Right.
And, I have seen in my clinical practice and in the research that when people don't have those beliefs, or those beliefs are not activated about, what's going to make them feel bad, that they actually can eat a huge variety of foods that they might have thought they weren't allowed to have. I do this online course. I teach an online course on intuitive eating, and someone in my course recently said that they had been prescribed an elimination diet, or, to stay on this diet that cut out like 27 different foods. And that's always a red flag to me, because there's actually science looking at different diagnostic tests and kind of, showing that a lot of diagnostic tests like that one that tells people they're allergic or intolerant to 27 different foods actually are not scientifically valid. Those tests are no better than chance at predicting the outcome, or predicting what someone is quote unquote intolerant to. And so these bogus diagnostic tests are actually making people fearful of all these different foods, when in fact, that particular type of test that this person was talking about is called an IgG test. It measures these things called immunoglobulin G antibodies in the blood. Turns out IgG antibodies in the blood actually just show what you've eaten recently. They're a marker of food sensitization or desensitization, not sensitivity to particular foods, but tolerance to particular foods. Your body's cool with those foods, and it makes those IgG, they're not even really antibodies, they're just kind of markers of, that your body is okay with these foods. Your body's had these foods, come into contact with them. It knows they're not a foe. It knows they're friendly. And so, when doctors, or oftentimes it's alternative medicine practitioners, are prescribing these IgG blood tests and telling people you're sensitive to these, 40 foods. And it's like, oh my God, these are things that I eat every day. Like, what can I eat? People will get so limited in what they're allowing themselves to eat based on these bogus tests, when in fact, all the test is showing is that, yeah, you do regularly eat those foods. Like, those are your staple foods,
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So I just need to interrupt real quick, because you're blowing my mind a little bit. And so first of all, I have some, I was going to talk, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I am someone who has an allergy to wheat and soy.
Mm-hmm.
And I have IBS and I have SIBO, not nocebo. I have SIBO. And I've done I've done an elimination diet, which was sort of given to me by I went to a naturopath at UCI, and they did a bunch of blood tests and, urine tests and fecal tests and all these tests. And I've got all sorts of weird stuff going on, apparently. And a lot of that is bacteria. A lot of that, apparently, my testosterone is turning into estrogen. So I have super high estrogen. It's very weird. Part of my question to you, Christy, is like, gosh, now I'm feeling maybe a little bit like cheated, or like maybe this wasn't the test that you were describing, but like, should I feel cheated?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, it's like, feel however you feel,
Yeah.
And I totally understand feeling cheated. I think a lot of people do when they realize that some of these tests they've been given aren't effective and don't have any real diagnostic value. And I think that, I'm always careful to say that there are really good naturopaths out there. There are some in my community of health at every size providers that are great and that really get it in terms of diet culture and don't prescribe elimination diets for for almost anyone. They know that people who have a history of disordered eating are really vulnerable and, probably not a great candidate for elimination diets. But I would say that the naturopathic community in general, and, barring those people who really get it, tends to be pretty caught up in what I call the wellness diet, which is this new modern manifestation of diet culture that's like, it's not about, it's not a diet, it's wellness. It's not a diet, it's a healthy lifestyle. And very quick to diagnose food sensitivities or blame food for whatever health condition, the person has. And often the first line of treatment that they engage in is eliminating a huge host of foods or putting someone on an elimination diet. And I just think that that is really problematic and not helpful to a lot of people because, we do live in diet culture where, you and I and probably everyone we know, everyone listening to this podcast, or most people anyway, have had some struggles in their relationship with food.
Yeah.
And prescribing something to do with food and having food be the primary treatment is, in my mind, pretty irresponsible in a culture like this, where people take it in a direction often that does more harm than good. And, and that's also to say nothing of the fact that it's just ineffective, right? That oftentimes cutting out all these foods that people, and, for you, I don't know which tests you had and certainly I don't want to say that like any of these allergies are impossible to have. So wheat allergy is definitely a thing, soy allergy is definitely a thing. But to test for that effectively, there are blood tests that measure, I think it's IgA antibodies, A as in awesome, like the ones you want to measure, that is sort of the gold standard that allergists think of as, a definitive diagnosis of a particular food allergy.
Yeah.
It might be IgE actually, because IgA is for celiac disease.
So I was tested
IgA
for
and
celiac.
IgE.
I do not have celiac, but my allergist took a few blood tests for the wheat and soy because I've always had, like, not always, but for a long time, I've had stomach issues, stomach cramps and bloating and aching and just all this nastiness. And it's only within the last like 5 to 7 years where I've really tried to do work on it and really listen to my body. And I will say that when I do eat wheat, it is problematic. I break out in hives and I have issues with bloating and cramping and diarrhea. It's not fun. So there are things I know for sure, but I guess let me bring this away from me because I feel like I'm talking about myself a lot. I know that hold on. Let me couch it in my experience real quick. I know that for me, like when I'm dealing with these sort of food sensitivities and things like that. Have you spoken to others who have had a lot of these things that, like, how do you have a healthy relationship with food when, you know, you're either being told maybe falsely or correctly that you have all of these issues, all these sensitivities, and then you start to kind of look at food in this, I think, perverted way to look at it, which is this bad or good, and I think that's wrong. So how do you get past that hurdle when you're someone who's struggling with some of these maybe legitimate food sensitivities?
Yeah, I think those are sort of two different issues. And so like whenever someone comes to me, you know, thinking they might have food sensitivities or been diagnosed, especially if they've been diagnosed by a naturopath, I usually recommend let's like confirm that these sensitivities are real first, because you know, if they're not showing up on a standard medical test, then maybe it's not something you need to worry about, and maybe the issue is more your relationship with food, anxiety about particular foods, like nocebo effect stuff, right? But when it's, you know, if it's something like you break out in hives, I think that's fairly clear, right? And you could get a test from a medical doctor to confirm that, you know, you do have an allergy to wheat. But then it becomes really, you know, more of an issue of self-care and permission too, right? So it's like, you know, you have full unconditional permission to eat wheat still, even if you're allergic to it, even if it causes you diarrhea and hives and swelling and bloating and stuff. And, you know, is that how you want to feel? Are you willing to, you know, experience those things and undergo those symptoms for the pure joy and mental health benefit of eating your favorite slice of sourdough?
Sometimes.
Yeah, you know, like, and that's totally within your right as a autonomous human being.
Yeah.
And also maybe there are times when you don't want to have to go through that, right? When you're like on a plane or giving a presentation or whatever it might be, you know, so you can be in charge of deciding that for yourself, and you can make those choices based on self-care. And so, you know, it's really up to you, I would say. You know, diet culture, I think, shames people for making choices that might lead to symptoms. And it also, you know, makes your symptoms out to be this thing, this sort of wild goose chase of like still having symptoms, cut out more foods, you know? And I think that's a really problematic approach, especially for those of us who struggle with disordered eating, because it can lead us right back down that path. But when it's something more clear cut, like diagnosed celiac disease, like diagnosed wheat allergy, like, you know, diagnosed peanut allergy or any other sort of obvious food allergy, then I think it's, you know, self-care and trade-offs. You know, what are you kind of willing to accept for the benefit or pleasure you might get out of eating this food?
Yeah. Sometimes, Christy, because frankly, there are a lot of things, a lot of foods that really upset my stomach, and I get frustrated, and I just want to drink all of the wine and just continue. And that's, you know, and I've had to sort of find a more balanced relationship with that, because it's just, food is a thing that we need to do. Food is something we need to eat. We need to eat in order to live, right? And it's this, it shouldn't be a battle, but sometimes it is a battle.
Totally. Yeah. And especially in this culture that tells us all these negative things about particular foods. I mean, the other piece is that, you know, disordered eating can also cause digestive issues in and of itself. And, you know, for someone even with a more remote history of an eating disorder, especially anorexia, you know, there's a really strong link between, well, really all eating disorders, I should say, but we have data showing that up to 98% of people with eating disorders have some kind of functional gut disorder. And, you know, that makes sense because eating disorders wreak havoc on your digestive system.
Yeah.
But the digestive problems can persist long after the eating disorder is gone. And, you know, there are things like SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that can emerge and, you know, be triggering symptoms when the disordered eating maybe was the initial cause, but it sort of self-perpetuates, and so the digestive stuff goes on. And I myself have IBS and, probably have always had it, but it was certainly exacerbated and flared up a lot with a disordered eating. Now that I'm recovered for, it's been 8 years or something, 7 years since I used any sort of disordered eating behavior, 10 years since I started really concerted effort at recovery. I'm still I don't have any disordered eating, but I still experience IBS from time to time from stress, from, eating too much spicy food or having acidic foods or drinks, too many acidic foods or drinks. It's kind of a dose response type of thing for me. And so, I definitely get that even though if disordered eating started the process, it could still be self-perpetuating on its own. And I think, for people listening, maybe who are still struggling with disordered eating behaviors, still engaging in some behaviors and have digestive distress, I think really the first line of defense, in my view, and the view of, most of my colleagues in the field of disordered eating and health at every size, is work on the disordered behaviors first. Heal your relationship with food and your eating behaviors first before you go down the road of trying to do, heal the gut. And if there are still issues with the gut after healing the disordered eating, there are actually things you can do that are just as effective as some of the diets that are recommended for IBS. Like yoga has actually been shown to be equally effective to the, I don't want to mention the diet, but there's one diet that a lot of doctors prescribe for IBS, and yoga has been shown to be equally effective. So has gut-directed hypnotherapy, interestingly.
Whoa.
And so, both of the fact that those things are equally effective to the diet, in my mind, means that, a lot of this effectiveness of the diet has to do with the mind-body connection, that it's not just about, how certain foods affect the gut. It's like your beliefs about how certain foods affect the gut, or your stress levels. Because if yoga and hypnotherapy are just as effective, those are things that focus on stress reduction, the mind-body connection, that don't have anything to do with food. And so that's cool, because if someone is struggling in their relationship with food and can't do an elimination diet, or that threatens to spiral them back down the path to disordered eating, they can try yoga, they can try gut-directed hypnotherapy. There's also medications you can try for IBS and SIBO that don't have anything to do with changing how you eat.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I was thinking of the book "The Body Keeps the Score." Have you read it?
I have, yeah. Actually, my agent for my book is the agent for that book too. So,
I swear, the listeners are probably so bored of me talking about this book, but it always comes back to Bessie, as I say.
Bessie.
I don't know. I'm when you're talking about doing yoga to sort of help with these things, it makes me think about that, because we hold so much in our bodies, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, listening to our bodies and being mindful of what's going on there, and it's such a powerful piece that I think we just ignore or actively hate.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, I think it really, there's so much there. There's so much with the mind-body connection that has yet to be explored, and that I think we could really do well to delve into as a culture, and not be placing so much emphasis on, just change what you eat, or, just take this pill and everything will be fine.
Yeah. So as two feely humans who are in quote unquote thin bodies, help me understand what thin privilege is. It's a term that I started sort of learning about within the past year, really. And I think it's important to recognize. I mean, I think it's important to recognize any privilege, but in the context of this conversation, can you help me and the listeners out with just what it means?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I think it's a confusing term sometimes, but, I think the real bottom line with any form of privilege is that a certain aspect of your identity allows you to get rights and respect and recognition that we all deserve, but that are really only afforded to people with that identity. So with thin privilege, it means, that we're able to get equal treatment in any setting. We're able to buy any airplane seat and fit into one seat and not have to pay for an extra seat. We're able to get hired for jobs and get raises, certainly depending on our gender and gender identity, it's a little more complicated, but, we're not denied jobs and promotions based on the size of our body. That we have all these rights and privileges that should be afforded to everyone. These things are fundamental human rights that only thin people in thin bodies in our society can access. And if you're in a larger body in our society, you go to the doctor's office and you're not going to get treated for the condition you come in for. Usually you're going to get a lecture on weight loss.
Right.
If you, want to go shopping with your friends, you might not be able to do that in a mainstream clothing store. You might only be able to shop online because stores don't carry your size. So those are some examples of how thin privilege and body-based oppression, size oppression show up in the world. So, having thin privilege doesn't mean we're awesome. It just means that we're afforded these rights and, general respect in the world that larger body people are not.
Yeah.
And that's not okay.
No, it's not. And it makes perfect sense. Like, I don't see how anyone could argue against that, but people have, right?
Mm-hmm. People have, yeah. I mean, the reason I say it doesn't mean we're awesome is that sometimes people hear me talk about thin privilege and write in all angry, like, who are you to say you're privileged and you think you're so great because you're thin, but aren't you supposed to be saying that everybody is good? And it's like, okay, that's one sort of misreading of the concept of privilege. People also get, I think, really upset when privilege is pointed out and when they have privilege. Sometimes it's hard, and I get it. It's hard to have your privileges pointed out to you, and sort of people say like you have these unearned privileges that helped you get where you were. It can feel like it's negating all the hard work you've done or the struggles you've had in your life. And, saying that we have thin privilege doesn't negate our struggles, right? You and I both had eating disorders. We both had long struggles with our bodies. And, we've both gone through other stuff in our lives. And, speaking for myself, I know that I haven't always liked my body. I've felt bad about my body a lot of the time. It sounds like you have too,
Totally.
So thin privilege doesn't insulate you from those things, right? Thin privilege doesn't mean you've never struggled in your relationship with your body or with food, or never hated your body or, wanted to change it. It just means that you have been afforded these basic rights that people in larger bodies are not because of any, earned, these are not earned things, right? We're afforded these basic rights just because we happen to be born into thinner bodies.
Yeah.
And we know from research that body size is largely genetic, that it's 70% of our weight can be attributed to genetic factors alone. So, there's not really much we can do to change the general size and shape that our bodies were meant to be. And so, really it's these unearned privileges that are giving us added benefits in society that someone in a larger body might not get. And, that's not to say that like I have a book deal, I have a business, I have, these sort of measures of success that I feel good about and that I worked really hard to get. And, someone who in a larger body who worked equally hard might not have gotten those things. So it doesn't negate the hard work of people with privilege. It just says, let's level the playing field so that everyone who works this hard is able to get to this place and not, be kept down because of some arbitrary characteristic.
I love that. Thank you. And I think it's so important, and it's such a opportunity for empathy, really, is recognizing that we have different experiences, recognizing the fact that the world is created for a thin body like myself, right? Or a white male like myself, right? Like, I think these things are important to call out and to talk about, to hopefully enact and move the needle on making the world a more inclusive place, making the world more open and generous and sort of open-hearted to all sizes, all sort of everyone, right? Like we are truly all in this together,
all of us.
So how, like, what are you doing, and what can we do, like, as individuals to help really bust up and break open that thin privilege, that like, is it another situation where we have Weight Watchers sort of like this behemoth corporation? You talk about airplane seats and stuff. Like, how do we start to enact change and be more open?
Yeah, such a good question. I mean, I think it starts with, individually recognizing these issues, right?
Yeah.
I was totally closed off to them myself, a little over 10 years ago, and didn't see these issues as a problem and saw body size as a personal responsibility. And it wasn't until I really looked into the research and really challenged those beliefs for myself that I started to open up and have that empathy for other people's experiences and for, specifically the experience of people in larger bodies.
Yeah.
And now I try to call out fat phobia when I see it, mostly through my work, but also if I happen to see it in my personal life, I will usually say something, and I say usually because we all have other things that come up, right? I might be having a bad mental health day and just am not able to engage, or late to get somewhere and don't have time, or whatever it might be. But, I really make an effort to stand up against fat phobia, just as I would stand up against racism or sexism or homophobia or any other form of oppression that I see in the world, just by saying something like, hey, that's not cool. Hey, that's not, don't say that. Or, hey, did you know, in the case of fat phobia, like, actually body size is not a matter of personal responsibility. Did you know that 70% of body size is genetically determined, or 98% of diets fail, or, judiciously applying science where I think that might get the message across, or excusing myself from the conversation if it's something that is triggering,
Yeah.
And I think that especially for people in larger bodies, building that boundary and taking yourself out of the conversation that's fat phobic, switching doctors if you go to a doctor who's fat phobic and won't listen to you and honor your boundaries, is a really helpful step. But I think for those of us who are thin allies to the fat acceptance movement, to body liberation, we have a major role to play in just calling out fat phobia when we see it. If we have kids or other people in our lives that we are caring for, if we're watching TV with them and something fat phobic comes on, we can say, hey, that's really fat phobic. I was just talking to a colleague of mine who has a daughter who, anytime something fat phobic or food shaming comes up in TV shows they're watching, my friend will pause it. And her daughter's 7 now. And she's like, oh, Mom, why are you pausing? She knows. But her mom will be like, in our family, we don't believe that. That's an example of fat phobia, or that's an example of food shaming. And
that's amazing.
Talking about it. And she said that her daughter, my podcast conversation is going to come out with her soon, so people will hear this. But, she said that her daughter uses the phrase health propaganda when she hears,
oh my God, I love that.
At school. So she'll be like, raise her hand and be like, are you going to tell us health propaganda?
Oh my gosh. So I am amazing. In love with that.
Me too. I know. So I love that little girl. Yeah. So, we all have roles to play. We all have little ways that we can move the needle on this stuff. But I think it starts with kind of getting our mind around it at first, so that we understand the problem. We understand diet culture as a system of oppression, and understand maybe the role that we've played in it. And, that's okay. We've all played a role in it, certainly in the past, but, forgiving ourselves and having compassion for ourselves for that, so that we can go on to help dismantle it.
Yeah. Have you seen these things that they're like, I don't know. I think the company is what do they call Soylent?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so this type of thing really bothers me because I think it's indicative of this kind of like a not even like an intuitive eating, right? It's like a mindless eating. It's like, here, this is everything, and it's it's certainly not, probably, but just take this shake, shug it down, and keep sort of. I mean, I think it's probably a lot more than just this food thing. It's probably indicative of like, be productive and that sort of whole cultural pressure. But like, I guess I don't really have a question other than like, I hate those things.
I agree. I fully hate those things too. I feel like it really does tie in with that capitalist pressure to always be doing and being productive and not thinking about food. Yeah. And also, the sort of diet culture pressure to eat quote unquote perfectly. And and it's interesting too. Soylent, I think, is particularly marketed to men, cisgender men in the tech field, especially. Yeah. I think that's who developed it, and it has this very sort of bro-y connotation too, I think, and sort of ties in with ideas about masculinity that are problematic as well.
Yeah. Anyways, I just have one sort of more sort of topic. You mentioned your friend's daughter being this amazing superhero. How do parents, for the parents listening, like how do parents deal with, because we mentioned Weight Watchers, targeting kids. Kids nowadays are so inundated with all of this diet culture we're talking about, all the stuff they see on TV, this fat phobia, these hearing parents their kids coming home to parents like talking about like, oh, I need to lose weight, or I need to not eat this thing anymore. Like, how do parents create a space where children are resilient to that?
This is such a great question. And I think, this is like so important in shaping our future, and shaping the future of the anti-diet movement. If parents can help their kids be resilient to this stuff and teach them a different way of relating to food and their bodies. So I think first and foremost is just, don't put your kid on a diet. Don't tell your kid to lose weight. Don't restrict sugar in the house, because, I think while parents are told that all of those things are healthy, right? Losing weight and restricting sugar, they're told that those are good things and that those are healthy for kids. What ends up happening is, in the case of weight loss, we know that it doesn't last, that, that statistic I told you, that 98% of people, up to 98% of people within 5 years regain all the weight they lost, usually more. Setting your kid up on that trajectory really, really puts them on a path to be fighting with food in their body for the rest of their lives, potentially. Yeah. And so, that's something you really want to, I'm sure any parent listening doesn't want that to happen for their kids. And dieting is unfortunately, a really common start to a lifetime of disordered eating. So yeah, I think that's one thing. And not restricting things like sugar or particular foods is another, because, barring a kid who has, say, a peanut allergy, of course, don't give them peanuts. But when they have sugar restricted or other food groups restricted without any medical necessity, what ends up happening is that they are irresistibly drawn to those foods, feel out of control around those foods. They don't have an opportunity to develop a peaceful and balanced relationship with those foods. And so, of course, they're going to end up eating them at a friend's house or eating them at school, or when they get old enough, after school, and they go buy it with their own money. And they're going to feel completely unhinged around those foods. And I see this all the time with, adults now describing their relationships with food growing up, or with kids. I sometimes work with families, and it's just heartbreaking to see that, because the parents think they're doing the right thing, and yet they're setting their kid up for this, push-pull kind of restriction pendulum with the food, where they feel completely out of control when they do get access to that food. So, yeah. Not depriving your kids of certain foods, not restricting them of food in general, allowing them to have what they want and eat till satisfaction, eat till they're full, is super important. And we're all born as intuitive eaters. We're all born knowing when we're hungry, being able to stop when we're full and turn our attention to other things, trusting that food is going to be available again when we want it. And unfortunately, a lot of stuff gets in the way of that, diet culture being kind of the most visible, but also food insecurity can get in the way of that trust and connection with our bodies and that intuitive relationship with food.
Yeah.
And so, to the extent that your kid still has that intuitive relationship with food, I think helping them hold on to it is super important. And to the extent that they've gotten away from it, helping them heal from that and helping them trust that actually food is going to be available and it's okay to eat what you want and no food is off limits and you're allowed to have sugar, you're allowed to have dairy, you're allowed to have gluten, whatever it may be, barring, of course, a genuine allergy. And genuine in the sense that, we just talked about earlier, where there's the false diagnoses that are sort of rampant out there. And then there's the genuine ones where you can actually see like, oh yeah, my kid breaks out in hives every time they drink milk. Okay, maybe we don't give them milk.
Right.
But, allowing all foods to the extent possible, given the child's medical necessities or limitations, so that they can develop a peaceful relationship with all foods. And it's really amazing when that happens to see that kids might, especially ones who've been restricted of particular foods like sugar, they might go to town on that for a while. They might be like, oh, you said I can eat brownies. I'm going to eat all the brownies. But then eventually they really do calm down. They really do trust that they have permission to eat that whenever they want. And then they turn their attention away from that and onto other things. And they eat a wide variety of foods and trust that the foods they love will be there. And, an example of this from my own life is that when I was dieting and disordered eating, I used to think that I couldn't control myself around carbs, right? And, the Atkins and low carb diets I were on were a reason for that because I was depriving myself of them. But I used to think if I ever have like chips in the house or cereal or cookies, I can't stop until the bag or box is gone. And so I better not buy them. Well, now I have in the other room a pantry full of those things. And I don't think about them unless I'm telling a story like this, or unless I am looking for what to eat for breakfast or a snack or lunch or whatever. And, I used to think that that was impossible. 5-10 years ago, that would just be 10 years ago, certainly 15 years ago, definitely.
Yeah.
I would have thought that was just impossible.
Yeah, that's powerful. It's such a like no-brainer psychologically in the terms of in the sense of like when my parents told me I couldn't watch R-rated movies, of course I was going to go do that at my friend's house. Like, of course, like the kids that are like deprived, they're living in a very strict household where, whatever, then this may be this is certainly not science, but like you see it all the time where the kids are growing up in very strict homes and then they go to college and they just go wild, right? Mm-hmm. It makes total sense. Yeah.
The forbidden fruit tastes the sweetest. And when we're deprived of and restricted of things and we don't learn sort of a nuanced relationship with them, when it's just black and white, like, no, you can never have this, right, then the only alternative is to go over to the extreme, right? Yeah. Rather than, if you were able to, have the thing, and of course, we're not talking about like cocaine in moderation or anything like that, but if you're able to have, rated R movies where you talk about them with your parents, or have sugar and candy in the house where it's no big deal and you're allowed to have it, anytime you want, under, where it's not this forbidden fruit and where it's like your parents are condoning it and it's not being labeled off limits, people are going to develop a better relationship with those things. They're going to learn to engage with them in a self-caring way, and I truly see this in kids where it's like, oh, my tummy hurts. I don't want any more of that. Or, I've had enough. My little nephew was a really beautiful example of intuitive eating when he was like 2 and 3 years old, would be, eating ice cream or candy or something like that. And then just stop in the middle of it and be like, I'm done. And you couldn't possibly like get him to eat anymore. He was just like, nope, I'm going to go play now. Even though he loved those foods and those were like favorites, Yeah. So I think it's really amazing to see the power and agency that kids can have over their own bodies when we give them that permission.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's transition into empathy heroes. shall we? So, listeners, this is the part of the show where my guest and I each mention an empathy hero in our lives. Could even be a character from a movie or a book, an author we love, etc. I will go first to give Christy a moment to think about her empathy hero. My empathy hero this week is... So I've been spending a lot of time at this local coffee shop called Patch, and I've been spending a lot of time there because after my day job, I've been going there working on this new business I've been trying to build, and there's everyone there is lovely and so sweet, but there's one barista there in particular by the name of Rachel who's just so kind. And the other day she asked me like how I was doing, and I think she even worded it like, "What's exciting?" And I showed her. I was like, I was kind of at first reluctant to like share because I'm not much of I don't like talking about myself necessarily, even though I may have proven that wrong on this very podcast.
Not at all.
Thank you. But I was very excited about this thing that had happened. I got some like new merch design for this new thing I'm building, and I showed it to her, and she was like so excited for me, and she's like, "This is amazing, like maybe we can even sell some of it here in the coffee shop." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, that would be amazing." And she was just so loving and warm, and I just love being there when she's there, especially. So Rachel, if you're listening, probably not, but I don't care, you're my empathy hero this week.
Aw, that's really sweet.
Thanks.
That is reminding me of a situation. So I would say my husband is my empathy hero this week.
Sure.
Or in life. He's just really great at sort of knowing what's going on and reading the subtext in a lot of situations. One example being the first time that we visited my parents in California. It was, they were kind of supposed to be on good behavior, but for meeting a new love interest of their daughter for the first time, but it quickly sort of devolved into their usual bickering, and we were driving around, sort of doing a sightseeing tour in the car, and we were driving across the Golden Gate Bridge, or about to drive across the Golden Gate Bridge, and my parents got into this thing of like, "No, you got to go over here to get on the bridge. No, it's over here, and this is the right lane." And my dad, sort of despite my mom, was like, "Oh, it's over here? Oh, it's over here, you say? Okay, I'm going over here." And like, it was the entrance instead of parking. I think it was, we're going to be parking and like walking across the bridge. That's what it was. But he ended up driving back across the bridge to the other side because my mom had said that was the way, just thinking like, it was just like pure spite, and it was just ridiculous. And I had tried to explain my parents' relationship to my husband at that point a number of times, but I was like, it's really hard to describe because they're really good people and they mean well and they're so kind in so many ways, but there's just this thing that happens when they're together, and especially my dad just sort of gets in this angry, spiteful situation. But I wasn't like coming up with examples when I tried to describe it to him before, and then it happened in the moment, and like, my husband just squeezes my hand and looks at me with like these huge eyes and is like,
"Oh my gosh."
God. And, it just made me feel so seen and so understood, because I didn't have to like, I wasn't the one squeezing his hand. I'm actually pretty inured to that stuff at this point. So I was just like, oh God, here we go. And, for him to sort of have that response and just really see what I had been trying to tell him and just see what was going on in the moment made me feel really, really understood. So
that is incredibly adorable. And I love it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
What a sweet moment.
It was, yeah, a, really weird parental like eye roll moment that became very sweet and something that I'll always remember. So
that's amazing. My wife and I are rewatching The Office.
Oh, yes.
And we're in the stretch of season 6, I think, or 5, 6 maybe, where it's Pam and Jim's wedding. And sort of leading up into the wedding, they tell each other that they're going to take sort of mental pictures of each other. And they actually sort of like do it with their hands, like they're actually, clicking the camera button. Clearly, I don't know camera buttons. Is that what it's called?
That's the thing. Totally.
But it reminds me of that, what you just said. It's just little sweet moments that you'll remember forever.
Totally. I love that episode of The Office too. Yeah, definitely. It is one of my mental pictures. Aw.
By the way, I love your diction, Christy. You used the word inculcate earlier and then inured. Amazing.
Thank you. I credit my mom with that. She has my dad too, but mostly my mom has a huge vocabulary and never held back with the big words when I was growing up. So
great. That's great. I love it. All right, Christy, where can listeners connect with you, listen to your podcast, order your book?
Yes, all the things. People can do all the things at my website, which is christyharrison.com. The book is at christyharrison.com/book, or just go to the book tab on the website to pre-order/order, depending on when this comes out. And you can find my podcast, Food Psych, wherever you're listening to this podcast. And Food Psych is spelled FOOD space PSYCH. Sometimes people want to add an E on the end or make it one word, but it's 2 words, no E, Food Psych.
Great. Well, listeners, all of those links are in the show notes for this episode. Christy, that was a delight. Thank you so much for being a part of You Me Empathy. Yeah,
thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Of course. And to you listeners, I'm here, you're here. We're here together on this wayward, overwhelming, awe-inspiring pale blue dot. We have each other. It's You, Me, Empathy.
La, la, la.